There are some people we stop speaking to, but never stop hearing. Their name doesn't come up in conversation anymore, but it still comes up inside you, without warning, without permission. You hear their laugh in a stranger's voice. You feel their presence in places they've never been. You've tried to move on. You've blocked, deleted, meditated, journaled, distracted. You've told yourself, it's over. But something inside you disagrees. And that something isn't your ego. It's your soul. We're so quick to label these persistent thoughts as unhealthy. We call them obsession. We treat them like emotional addiction. We shame ourselves for not letting go fast enough. But what if it's not a failure to let go, but an invitation to finally listen? Carl Jung wrote that what remains unconscious doesn't disappear. It becomes fate. When a relationship ends before the soul has spoken its truth, a split is formed, a fracture between what you lived and what you never allowed yourself to feel. That fracture doesn't disappear with time. It becomes autonomous. It begins to speak in images, in dreams, in the person you can't stop thinking about, because the soul doesn't forget what the ego buried. It archives it, and it waits until you're finally strong enough to feel what you couldn't feel then. According to Gregg Braden, emotional experiences don't just live in the brain. They live in the electromagnetic field of the heart. They're stored vibrationally, so when someone touches us deeply, especially during a vulnerable chapter, they leave a resonance, an energetic imprint, and until that imprint is witnessed, felt, and integrated, it returns. This isn't nostalgia. It's energetic incompletion. And maybe you're not crazy. Maybe you're not addicted. Maybe this is sacred. Maybe this is your soul trying to finish a conversation you silenced too soon, not with them, but with yourself, because the person isn't always the message. Sometimes they're just the symbol, and when you finally listen, not to the past, but to the part of you that never got to speak, something begins to shift, not instantly, not perfectly, but honestly. So this isn't about letting go, it's about letting speak. Let's begin. There are certain heartbreaks that don't fully break you because they were never allowed to. Moments that passed like storms you didn't have time to name. You told yourself, it's fine, I've moved on. You got dressed, you answered emails, you smiled when you needed to. But beneath the surface, the story didn't end. It simply went quiet, filed away somewhere the mind doesn't visit, but the soul never leaves. Because the soul doesn't close books. It memorizes the unfinished pages. When something is too painful to feel, the psyche creates a kind of psychic attic. It stores the unspoken words, the unshed tears, the truth you didn't yet have the strength to name. And time does nothing to erase that archive. It only makes the silence louder. Carl Jung saw this clearly. He believed that the contents of the unconscious never disappear. They return, not as memories, but as patterns. So when you think of someone over and over again, even when you've left them behind in every practical way, what if it's not about them? What if it's the soul trying to return to the place where it was interrupted? Gregg Braden's exploration of emotional resonance confirms this in another language. When a moment of deep emotional charge occurs, especially one left unresolved, the heart's electromagnetic field stores it, not in words, but in vibration, a feeling, a tone, a psychic echo. And the longer it remains unprocessed, the more insistently it returns, as déjà vu, as a dream, as a sudden grief that seems to come from nowhere. This is not failure. This is a form of fidelity, because the soul is loyal to what the mind denies. You can silence an emotion in the moment, but the soul keeps the letter, unsent, unread, unresolved. And years later, when your life looks different, it's that letter you feel rustling beneath your thoughts, whispering the name you swore you were done with. But maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's the moment your soul wasn't allowed to finish, And the thought that keeps returning is just the envelope waiting to be opened. Sometimes we believe we're haunted by someone, but what truly lingers is a version of ourselves. A self that was just beginning to emerge in their presence, one we didn't know how to keep when they left. Not all longing is for another. Some of it is for the person you almost became. We say, "I miss them," but often what aches is not their voice or their touch, but the reflection of who you felt yourself becoming in their gaze. More alive, more open, more seen. The illusion begins when we equate the person with the transformation. We tell ourselves, if I still think about them, it must mean they were the one. But what if they were never meant to stay, only to mirror? Carl Jung described the phenomenon of projection as a necessary but dangerous stage of development. In the early phases of love, we don't fall for the other. We fall into our own unconscious material, cast like light onto the figure standing in front of us. Gregg Braden reminds us that the heart doesn't just store feelings, it records states of being. When a relationship awakens a new layer of self-awareness, that emotional field remains encoded long after the person is gone. So the recurring thought might not be pulling you back to them. It may be calling you forward to reclaim the self that bloomed in their presence, to finish becoming the one you were starting to be. The memory of them becomes like a reflection on water. You keep reaching for the image, but the source of the light is within you. It was never about going back. It was about recognizing what part of you got left behind in that season, and what part of you is still waiting to be reclaimed. Because sometimes the soul grieves, not for a person, but for the version of itself it didn't get to fully live. Some connections arrive with a voltage we cannot explain. They feel fated, mythic, like we've met them before in another life, or perhaps in a dream we forgot upon waking. We don't just feel attracted, we feel claimed. And yet, it rarely ends gently. Because these connections don't come to complete a story, they come to uncover one. Carl Jung understood this. He taught that archetypes, universal, symbolic patterns of energy, live inside the collective unconscious. And when they are not consciously integrated, they do not stay silent. They project themselves outward onto those we meet, fall for, fear, or can't forget. You didn't fall in love with a person. You fell in love with a figure, the lover, the muse, the destroyer, the protector, the guide. They walked into your life not just as themselves, but as carriers of something larger than themselves. And when you think of them now, you're not simply recalling a relationship. You're reactivating a symbolic force that your soul still doesn't fully own. Gregg Braden reminds us that what we emotionally resonate with is often what we're biologically wired to evolve through. So the intensity you felt may not be about compatibility, but about transformation. That person, in their very presence, mirrored a part of you still waiting to be integrated. A creative fire, a sensual depth, a destructive honesty, a hunger for transcendence. And until that archetypal energy is brought home, claimed, understood, embodied, it will not leave you. It will keep returning through new faces, new stories, but always the same energy. Like a dream you're destined to repeat until you finally understand the symbol it came to bring. The soul is not looking for the one. It's looking for the forgotten parts of itself, disguised in the people it can't seem to let go of. Some truths never reach the surface, not because they didn't matter, but because speaking them felt too dangerous at the time. So you kept them sealed, beneath politeness, beneath fear, beneath the illusion of strength. You let them leave, or you left them, with words still lodged in your chest. And though the story ended on the outside, it never found its voice on the inside. We're told that closure is something we find in conversation, but sometimes the real closure is in confession, not to the other, but to the self. Carl Jung taught that until a truth is brought into consciousness, it exerts power in the shadows. What is unspoken becomes a silent command. It directs our dreams, our longings, our repeated attractions. And Greg Braden reminds us that coherence, that deep alignment between the heart and the brain, cannot exist where truth is being withheld. So the memory returns, not to haunt you, but to give you another chance to hear yourself, to allow your soul to say what your voice never did. Not to be understood, but to feel yourself understanding, to bring light to the place that once held fear. Because some thoughts don't fade until they are heard, not by another, but by the part of you that still wonders what might have happened if you had just spoken the truth that day. And this is why their name still echoes, not for reconciliation, but for resolution. The memory is not asking you to go back. It's asking you to bear witness to the words that were left behind, like unanswered prayers, like a song that ended mid-note, waiting still for the final chord. Not every returning thought is a desire. Not every emotional echo is longing. Sometimes the soul speaks in disguise, and the image of the one you can't forget isn't the destination, but the message. There are names that return not to rekindle, but to remind. Faces that visit your memory because they were once vessels of something sacred, a lesson, a vow, a part of your deeper path that never found its voice. Carl Jung wrote that the psyche speaks in symbols, not in facts. It doesn't speak of the person themselves, but of what they represent. And Greg Braden's work in heart-brain resonance suggests that emotional signatures, especially those unresolved, remain active in our energetic field, not as a trap, but as a transmission. So the memory is not always asking for reunion, it may be asking for recognition. Sometimes a person shows up in thought because your soul is trying to reach you through their image, a forgotten dream, a creative path you abandoned, a truth you promised yourself but never lived. And yet it's so easy to get caught in the shape of the memory, to think it's about wanting them again. But what if chasing the image is what keeps you from decoding the message? Because when the soul cannot get your attention directly, it often uses memory as a carrier. And the person you're thinking about may not be the point. They may be the bird in the forest, calling not for you to follow it, but for you to turn toward the direction it's pointing. Something is awakening, not to go back, but to go inward. Some names are not just names. They are thresholds. They don't remind you of a person. They return you to a place in your soul, a season, a version of yourself, a sacred fragment of a story that never fully closed. You hear their name, and something stirs, not because they are still meant for your life, but because they were once a doorway into a part of you you didn't know how to stay with. We often believe forgetting is the path to freedom. We try to erase the traces, cut the cords, block the memories. But the soul does not seek erasure. It seeks witnessing. Carl Jung understood that the psyche demands meaning. When something significant happens, especially in love, it carves a symbolic imprint. And until that meaning is fully honored, the experience remains active, like an unfinished ritual waiting to be completed. Greg Braden has written about the ancient practice of intentional emotional coherence, how rituals were used not to change the past, but to release the energy still carried from it. There are names that activate more than memory. They activate a sacred site within, not a person, but a moment of personal truth that shaped your becoming. Sometimes it isn't silence that's needed, but ceremony. Not to send the words to them, but to say them to the story, to write to the moment itself, to stand at the ruins of what was once beautiful and speak gratitude, sorrow, forgiveness, not to rebuild the temple, but to honor what it once awakened in you. Their name is not the ache, it is the altar. And some altars must be visited once more, not to worship, but to remember who you were when you first touched the divine within yourself. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. There is a kind of longing that feels bottomless. It isn't about wanting them back, it's about wanting something back through them, a part of you that still feels unfinished, unseen, unclaimed. Not all projections happen in presence. Some of the strongest ones happen in absence. When someone is no longer there to contradict your fantasies, the shadow begins to speak through silence. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is not just what we dislike about ourselves. It's what we are not yet willing to love. And often, we assign that unloved part to someone who once made us feel temporarily whole. So their absence becomes charged, not with who they are, but with who we hoped they would be for us. We replay the story not because it was perfect, but because it held a fantasy we have not yet made peace with. Gregg Braden's work reminds us that coherence, the alignment between heart and mind, cannot be achieved while we are split, longing for healing from an external figure while ignoring the internal part still crying to be met. You may be clinging to the one who didn't choose you because a part of your shadow still believes that being chosen by them would finally prove your worth. But the soul doesn't seek validation. It seeks wholeness. And sometimes the one we can't forget is only a mirror for the part of us still waiting to be forgiven, still waiting to be embraced, still waiting to be chosen, not by them, but by us. It is easy to chase ghosts, harder to sit with the reflection that created them. But in doing so, we begin to retrieve what was never truly theirs to hold: the tenderness, the self-worth, the love that was projected outward, but was always meant to come home. There are stories that don't end when they end. They end when they are understood, and until that moment arrives, the soul continues to circle, not to punish, not to confuse, but to complete a conversation that was never truly finished. We are often told to move on, to forget, to distract, but the soul does not respond to forgetting. It responds to integration. Carl Jung wrote that the psyche seeks wholeness, not perfection. It isn't trying to fix the past, it's trying to retrieve something essential from it. And when a chapter in love remains unresolved, when the meaning is unclear, when the truth is unspoken, the energy of that moment doesn't dissolve, it waits. Gregg Braden reminds us that emotional memory is vibrational. It has its own frequency, and unfinished experiences remain active in the heart's electromagnetic field until the emotional current finds its resting place. So the thoughts persist, the images replay, and the memory comes not to bring you back, but to move you through. Because the soul is not done until the story is heard, the feeling is honored, and the voice within you says the final word, not in anger or regret, but in awareness. Some stories must be spoken aloud in silence, with a candle, with a name, with a truth that was once too sharp to touch, not for them to hear it, but for you to feel it. Only then does the cycle begin to close, not by forgetting, but by finishing, like a sentence that waited years for the breath to finally complete it. Not every recurring thought is a sign of weakness. Not every lingering memory is a failure to let go. Sometimes it is the soul speaking in repetition, not to trap you in the past, but to invite you into the part of yourself that never had a voice. We are quick to judge what we can't silence. We label it obsession. We call it emotional dependence. But what if this persistence is devotion? What if it is the most sacred part of you trying again and again to complete a sentence it was never allowed to speak? This is not about the person, it never was. It's about the mirror they carried, the door they opened, the name they spoke in you that you forgot how to answer without them. Carl Jung knew this terrain well. He taught that the psyche moves not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. And wholeness means honoring what was left behind. Gregg Braden showed us that when the heart and the brain come into coherence, the emotional field begins to heal itself. Not through force, but through presence. So maybe this isn't about forgetting. Maybe this is about listening, patiently, gently, deeply, until there is nothing left to hear. Until the thought no longer returns because the soul has finally spoken, and the silence that follows feels like peace.